Jamie lay in bed, the thin walls of his small house doing little to muffle the angry voices rising from downstairs. His parents were at it again, fighting over money, his dad's job, or something else Jamie didn't care to decipher. They were always fighting these days, and Jamie had learned to tune it out. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, like something dark was creeping in around the edges of his little world. He turned over, staring at the wall for what felt like hours, trying to sleep but unable to shake the unease gnawing at his stomach. He could still hear their voices, his dad's gruff shouting, his mom's sharp retorts, twisting and mingling with the creaks of the house settling. Jamie squeezed his eyes shut, wishing for silence, for peace. But instead, the quiet beckoned him. It called from beyond the walls, pulling him toward the window, as if the night outside was whispering his name. Slowly, Jamie sat up and threw off the covers. The dim light of the moon barely filtered through the trees outside, casting long, twisted shadows across his room. He padded to the window on bare feet, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath him, and peeked through the thin curtain. The woods behind their house loomed tall and dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Normally, Jamie found them comforting, solid, unmoving sentinels that had stood for as long as he could remember. But tonight, they seemed different. The shadows between the trunks seemed to shift unnaturally, like something was hiding in the spaces where the moonlight couldn't reach. And then, he saw it. At first, Jamie thought it was just another tree, something tall and thin, swaying with the wind. But as he squinted, his breath catching in his throat, the figure took on a more sinister shape. It was too tall, too slender to be a person, yet not solid enough to be a tree. It stood impossibly still, just beyond the first row of trees, half shrouded in darkness. Jamie leaned closer to the glass, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely make out its features, if it had any at all. The thing seemed to blend into the shadows, its body elongated and unnaturally thin, and its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, pale. Like something had stripped away all the features, leaving nothing but smooth skin. Jamie's mouth went dry, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in his throat. His heart thudded painfully against his ribcage, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. The tall man didn't move. It didn't need to. It just stood there, watching him, or sensing him. Jamie wasn't sure how he knew, but he felt the thing's gaze on him, even though it had no eyes. The sound of his parents arguing downstairs faded away, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. Jamie couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure in the woods, even as dread clawed at his insides, urging him to turn away, to hide under his covers, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. And then the tall man did something Jamie would never forget. It leaned forward, just slightly, as if acknowledging Jamie's gaze, as if it was responding to him. Its long arms stretched downward, fingers too long and spindly to be human, reaching nearly to its knees. In the next instant, the figure disappeared, not into the woods, not fading into the shadows. It simply vanished, like smoke caught in the wind. Jamie staggered back from the window, tripping over his own feet and crashing onto the floor. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He crawled back to his bed and dove beneath the covers, curling up in a tight ball, trying to shut out the memory of what he had just seen. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass in the window pane. Every creak, every gust of wind sent his heart racing. He could still feel it. That thing. The tall man, watching him from the trees. It was out there, waiting for him to look again. Minutes dragged by. The argument downstairs finally stopped, but the house felt eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. Jamie lay under his covers, too afraid to move, too afraid to even peek outside again. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to fall asleep, to forget about the faceless figure that had stared back at him from the woods. The next morning, Jamie awoke to the sound of his mom's voice, but it wasn't comforting. Her voice was hushed, tight with fear. He sat up, the events of last night rushing back to him, making his stomach churn. His mom was talking to their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gray. From the crack in the door, Jamie could see their pale, worried faces. "Have you heard from Mrs. Henderson?" his mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Gray shook her head. "No one's seen her since last night. She didn't come home. The door was wide open, but her car's still there." Jamie's blood ran cold. He looked back toward the window, but he didn't dare go near it. Something dark and dangerous was in those woods, and Jamie knew deep down that it wasn't done with them yet. And worst of all, it wasn't just a ghost story anymore. It was real. It had seen him, and it was coming closer. The neighborhood felt different after Mrs. Henderson went missing. Jamie could feel it in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on everything. People didn't linger outside anymore, and parents kept their kids close, even during the day. Conversations were hushed, fearful glances exchanged like dark secrets. But no one was saying what Jamie knew to be true. It was the tall man. He was out there, in the shadows, waiting. Jamie kept to himself at school. The other kids had started talking about the disappearances in their own way, weaving wild stories about kidnappers and ghosts. But Jamie knew the truth. He saw the tall man again almost every night now. Sometimes he caught glimpses of him between the trees, sometimes nearer to the house, always just far enough away that Jamie could never be sure if he was really seeing it or if his mind was playing tricks on him. The nights were the worst. They stretched on endlessly, filled with thick, suffocating silence. Jamie could hardly sleep, too afraid to close his eyes, but even more afraid to look outside. He kept his curtains drawn tight. But that didn't stop the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. One night, as Jamie lay in bed, trying to force himself into sleep, he heard a noise. A faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against the window. His body froze, his heart slamming against his chest so hard he thought it might explode. "It's nothing," he told himself, "just the wind, just a tree branch." But the scratching continued, soft and insistent. He wanted to pull the covers over his head and block it out, but instead, he found himself crawling slowly out of bed, drawn to the window by a force he couldn't resist. His legs trembled as he reached for the curtains, fingers brushing the fabric. "Don't look. Don't look," his mind screamed, but his body didn't listen. With a sharp pull, he yanked the curtain aside. There was nothing there, just the dark night and the skeletal trees swaying in the wind. Jamie let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He pressed his forehead against the glass, trying to steady himself. Maybe it really had just been the wind. Maybe. Then something shifted at the edge of the yard. It was barely visible, just a shadow among shadows. But Jamie knew what it was. His heart stopped. He pressed closer to the glass, squinting through the darkness. And there it was. Tall, thin, standing impossibly still just inside the tree line. The tall man. Jamie's breath fogged up the window as he stared at the figure. This time, it was closer than ever before. Its long, spindly arms hung unnaturally low, the fingers nearly brushing the ground. And its face, if you could even call it that, was still smooth, blank, devoid of any human features. But somehow, Jamie could feel it looking right at him, even through the glass. A deep chill spread through his body, rooting him to the spot. The tall man tilted its head, as though considering Jamie. And then, slowly, it lifted one of its arms, the fingers stretching out, curling toward him. Jamie backed away from the window, heart pounding, his mouth dry with terror. He stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of books and falling hard onto the floor. But he didn't take his eyes off the window, afraid that if he blinked, the tall man would be gone. Or worse, closer. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from downstairs. Jamie flinched, his head snapping toward the door. His parents were asleep. He knew they were. They had been unusually quiet tonight, not even bothering to fight like they usually did. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. The house was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to protect him from the things outside. But now... There was another thud, louder this time. Jamie scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He needed to check on his parents. He needed to make sure they were okay. but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor, paralyzed by fear. Then came the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, like furniture being moved, or worse, like a body being dragged. Jamie's heart leaped into his throat. He had to move. He couldn't just stay here. Not if the tall man had found a way inside. Summoning all the courage he could muster, Jamie bolted for the door, flinging it open and racing down the hallway. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The house was eerily quiet again, but that only made the tension worse. He tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to make any noise. His footfalls echoed in the stillness as he reached the bottom and crept toward the living room. That's when he saw it. His dad's arm was poking out from behind the couch. At first, Jamie thought he was just lying there, maybe asleep, but then he noticed the unnatural angle. His fingers twitched once before going still, and Jamie's breath caught in his throat. Blood. There was so much blood, pooling around the arm, soaking into the carpet. Jamie's legs wobbled, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat, trapped by terror. His father was dead. He knew it without even seeing his face. And the tall man... He must have... Suddenly, something crashed in the kitchen, followed by a low, guttural moan that sent a cold shiver down Jamie's spine. His mother. She was still alive, at least for now. Jamie forced his legs to move, stumbling toward the kitchen door. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out all rational thought. He had to get to her. He had to save her. But when he reached the doorway, his world shattered. His mother was lying on the kitchen floor, her body twisted in a grotesque manner, blood oozing from gashes along her arms and legs. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring blankly at the ceiling. The light above flickered, casting her in and out of shadow, making her look almost like a doll. Something broken, discarded. And standing over her, looming impossibly tall, was the tall man. Its long arms were stretched out, the fingers almost lovingly caressing her bloodied skin. It moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment. Jamie couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch, as the tall man straightened and turned its faceless head toward him. Jamie let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward into the hallway. The tall man didn't move to follow. It didn't need to. The thing just stood there, its long arms hanging loose, its featureless face seeming to bore into Jamie's soul. Terror flooded his body. He turned and ran, not stopping until he was back in his room, slamming the door shut behind him. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as he pressed his back against the door, desperate to block out the memory of what he'd just seen. The tall man had taken them both. His parents were gone, and Jamie was alone. Alone with it. For a long moment, the house was silent, save for the frantic pounding of his heart. Then, softly, from the other side of the door, came the slow, deliberate sound of scratching. Jamie didn't know how long he sat there, back pressed against the door, trembling in the dark. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't untangle. His parents were gone. He'd seen the blood, the lifeless bodies, the tall man looming over them like death itself. But now, all that remained was silence. And that scratching sound. It came intermittently, like claws being dragged across wood, slow and methodical, just outside his door. Each scrape sent waves of terror through Jamie's body, freezing him in place. His hands clutched the doorknob tightly as though that would keep the tall man out. But deep down, Jamie knew better. There was no keeping it out. The tall man was here for him. He had always been the final prize. The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, Jamie dared to hope that maybe it had gone away. Maybe the nightmare was over. But as soon as that thought crossed his mind, a soft, creaking sound filled the silence. The unmistakable sound of the hallway floorboards groaning under a weight that wasn't human. The sound grew closer, slow, but steady, like it was taking its time, like it was savoring every step. Jamie's breath hitched in his throat. He had to move, had to do something, but his body refused to obey. His legs were jelly, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The darkness in the room seemed to close in around him, thick and suffocating, as though the shadows themselves were alive. watching. The creaking stopped just outside the door. Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. But what could he possibly do against something like the tall man? What could stop something so ancient, so malevolent? The doorknob rattled ever so slightly, as though something long and spindly had brushed against it. Tears welled up in Jamie's eyes, blurring his vision. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to face it. But the tall man didn't care about his readiness. It was coming for him, whether he was prepared or not. A noise broke the stillness, a bark, sharp and urgent. Jamie blinked through his tears, his attention snapping toward the window. It was Max, the neighbor's dog, barking furiously in the yard. The sound was almost a relief, a reminder that something else still existed in this world besides the relentless terror that had taken over Jamie's life. But the barking quickly turned desperate, panicked. Jamie scrambled to his knees and crawled toward the window, hoping against hope that maybe the dog would scare the tall man away. But as he peered through the glass, his heart sank. Max was at the edge of the yard, snarling and barking at something just out of Jamie's line of sight. The dog's fur bristled, his lips curled back in a vicious snarl as he barked furiously into the darkness. Then, with a speed that made Jamie's stomach drop, something long and pale shot out from the shadows, wrapping around Max's body like a coil of rope. The dog yelped in pain, his body thrashing as he tried to break free. But the tall man's limbs only tightened, twisting unnaturally, bones cracking under the pressure. Jamie pressed a hand to his mouth to stifle his scream as Max was lifted off the ground, his body jerking violently. There was a sickening crunch, followed by silence. Max's body hung limp in the tall man's grasp. And then, with a sudden, swift motion, the dog was flung into the trees, disappearing into the shadows like he had never existed. Jamie fell back from the window, trembling uncontrollably. The tall man had no mercy, no remorse. It didn't just kill. It destroyed, mangled, broke everything in its path. And now, it was coming for him. The scratching at the door resumed, louder this time, more insistent. The doorknob rattled again, harder than before. Jamie could feel the pressure building, like something was pushing against the door from the other side. His gaze darted toward the closet. It was small, cramped, but it was his only chance. Heart pounding in his ears, Jamie forced himself to move. He crawled across the floor and pulled the closet door open, slipping inside just as the bedroom door creaked open. He pressed his back against the far wall of the closet, drawing his knees to his chest and covering his mouth with his hands to keep from making any sound. The air inside was stifling, thick with the scent of old clothes and fear. Jamie held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The tall man's presence filled the room. Jamie could hear it moving, slow, deliberate footsteps that barely made a sound but carried an overwhelming sense of dread. He couldn't see the creature from his hiding spot, but he could feel it. It was there, so close, just outside the closet. The whispers began again, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on a breeze. They slithered into Jamie's ears, into his mind, growing louder and more insistent. They weren't speaking words exactly, but their meaning was clear. The tall man was calling to him, urging him to come out, to surrender. "It's over," the whispers seemed to say. "There's no point in hiding. You're mine." Jamie squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the whispers, but they only grew louder, filling his head with images of the tall man's long, thin arms, its blank face hovering inches from his own. And then, he heard a familiar voice. A whisper, soft and terrifying. "Jamie." He turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Only the darkness. The door creaked open slowly. The last sound he would ever hear.